Hey, you're listening to the Start Something podcast, where we take you behind the scenes of the founder journey, breaking down what it takes and how it can change your life. My name is Bailey.
And my name is Shruti, and today we're going to be talking about the art of rejection therapy. So Bailey, I have a story to share with you.
Please.
So this is like a friend telling me a story. Picture that you're sitting at a restaurant with me, right? And this restaurant is full, it's loud, like there's a bunch of noise going on, and you suddenly decide to get on the floor of the restaurant and start screaming. Okay?
Okay.
And this girl was painting this picture for me, and she's like, you should give it a try. And how do you think people would react?
I think people would probably run to you or to the person on the floor, and they would probably be freaked out, and hopefully they'd want to help.
Yeah. And then your reaction is like, oh no, everything's okay. They'd look at you really weirdly, right?
Yeah, they'd probably be upset and confused.
Exactly.
As I am right now.
Exactly. So how does that tie into today's episode?
Please tell me.
So the art of rejection therapy is to put yourself out there in uncomfortable situations where you know people are going to say no, situations where people are going to react poorly or weirdly or judge you. And the idea and the goal is that you put yourself in these crazy situations enough times and you'll become numb to any type of poor response.
Okay, but did that actually happen?
I didn't do it. This girl, I didn't do it. No, just to set the scene. No one actually did it. But we're sitting at a restaurant, me and my friend, and she's like explaining to me the art of rejection therapy. And I'm just picturing myself doing it. And then I asked myself, I'm like, wow, as an entrepreneur, we're doing this all the time, right? And so maybe I didn't tell the story as well.
I thought it was a great story. I definitely was alarmed just as an audience member listening to her telling you this story. And so I totally get it. I think what she's getting at is this idea that by putting ourselves out there and doing things that are not only uncomfortable, but are specifically uncomfortable because of the way that people react to you, it actually desensitizes us to the discomfort of their judgment. Is that what the moral of the story is?
Maybe you should just run the podcast.
I just want to make sure I'm interpreting everything correctly. But no, even hearing that story makes me viscerally uncomfortable to imagine being in that situation.
Yeah.
I mean, I would hate being in that situation if I was in physical pain. Like if I actually was drawing that kind of attention to myself, I would be so embarrassed. And so I know what you mean, because even as an audience member, hearing you tell that story, I'm like, I hope that never happens to me.
Yeah.
But it's kind of a funny example of a strategy that works really well when it comes to rejection, which is putting yourself in those uncomfortable situations so that you have to get used to them, and critically, so you realize they don't actually hurt as badly as you'd think. Because when you imagine getting rejected, or I'll speak for myself, when I imagine getting rejected, I go into fight or flight.
Yeah.
And I used to go into fight or flight pretty severely. I was so afraid of putting myself out there and getting rejected by an investor, let's say. And what I learned from having to do those pitches, and what I learned from getting rejected, is it doesn't hurt nearly as badly as I thought it would. It's kind of uncomfortable and I'm kind of embarrassed, oh man, I wish they hadn't passed. But within a few minutes, you kind of get back up and you're like, okay, well, and let's say maybe a few hours, you get back up and you're like, oh, that didn't kill me. That wasn't as hard as my brain had imagined it would be, which means how much more willing am I to put myself in those uncomfortable positions?
Exactly.
So even though that is a very extreme example that your friend shared with you, I definitely understand it. And I actually had a professor who put me through a rejection therapy exercise.
Oh, no way.
Me and all my classmates.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And he literally called it rejection therapy. And he gave us a little clear plastic box. And this was at an entrepreneurship program that I did abroad. And he gave us, every team was given this little clear plastic box, just kind of a random object. And what we had to do was go out of the classroom, into the wild, into the city, and approach strangers and ask them if they'd be willing to trade that little box for something that they had.
Yeah.
And the goal was to bring back the most interesting or epic thing. And it's already intimidating to go up and ask someone for something, especially something so weird.
Yeah.
You know, hey, I have this little box. would you trade anything that you have for this little box that I have? That's obviously not a social situation that you have on a regular basis. But at first it's really uncomfortable. You really don't want to do it. But as you go up and do more and more trades, it becomes easier and easier. So at the end of the day, when we are leaving with like our final objects, we're actually excited to run up to people and say, hey, I have this bottle of wine. Would you trade it for me for something that you have? And people are like, this is so weird, but okay. And it's kind of fun for them too.
Exactly.
And so I remember so viscerally the discomfort of being like, oh, I don't want to do this, especially at the time I was in Italy and I wasn't in a place where everyone just spoke English. It was not as easy to communicate. And it was like those first few, I was like, oh, so nervous. But over time, it got easier and easier and easier to walk up and ask that weird question, like, will you trade this thing? And some students came back with bottles of wine or, you know, other things that they could eat for dinner. So there were tons of food items. One person and their team actually came back with a couch. Like they literally carried a couch all the way back to the class. I think they had something to prove, and they did. They proved it. I think they won. But the point is, even though some people were like, oh no, this is weird, a lot more people than you might have expected actually said, okay, I've got this book. Can I give you this book? And they didn't even want that little clear box. But since you're asking them, they're like, okay. And I'm so grateful that my professor put me through that exercise because it genuinely helped me so much when it comes to getting rejected in every way when it comes to business, but also getting rejected in my personal life. Because if you have a dream and you want to put yourself out there, you're setting yourself up to be rejected because someone's going to say no, probably a whole lot of someone's, and your job is to keep going until you find the people that say yes. And so I feel like so much of success has to do with this numbers game, which is how much am I willing to put myself out there before I let somebody's no, this is impossible, you'll never succeed, before I let that stop me. And so learning how to take that rejection and bounce back is one of the most important skills I think anyone can develop as an entrepreneur.
And it's something that's underrated. It's not something that entrepreneurs think about as a skill oftentimes, and until you're in the game and then you realize, oh man, I'm getting rejected a lot. Like, I need to work on that. And, you know, a lot of people ask me, why did you become a product manager at Microsoft before you started your own company? And I think it's a good question. And it's because there's a fundamental skill set that I wanted to learn of being a PM that translates into being an entrepreneur. One of them being sitting on those customer calls with customer success teams or sales teams and getting bad feedback from your customers, right? And not taking it personally. When I spent so much passion and energy building products for my customers to use, and if something breaks and I hear a large customer complaint, honestly, when I first started working, I got personally emotional about it. I was like, oh my God, these customers, they hate me. Like, they don't want to work with me anymore. You know, is it my fault? Is it me? And over time, now when a customer picks up the phone and telling me, you know, there might be something wrong, X, Y, Z things, I'm like, I hear what you're saying. Let me figure out the best path solution. And I'm so much more calm. And to your point, you go into fight or flight mode when you're not used to the idea of rejection, when you're not used to a sales call going poorly. But it's a mindset shift, right? That's what the art of rejection therapy really teaches you. Eventually, you're so numb to it, you're like, all right, cool, let's move on to the next. And I think it's interesting to also see how that translates to even personal life, like to dating, especially with dating apps becoming extremely popular. I notice a lot of women are afraid to go on a date and be rejected afterwards. And it's interesting when I talk to a lot of my male friends, they're like, we're rejected day in and day out. We're so used to this feeling. We're lucky if something goes well. And women, they don't know how to handle rejection. Sometimes in the dating world, in my opinion, it's very different than the business world. So it's interesting that I love to run experiments on myself. This is one of them. I was like, let me see how many times I can get rejected, to a point where I don't take it personally. If it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. And when it works out, it's going to work out and it's going to be so much better. Like, I almost got rejected for a reason, right? And it has nothing to do with me. It has to do with them too, you know?
Right. And I think that mindset shift is the single most important thing you can do to deal with rejection, beyond the sheer quantity of rejections, right?
Yeah.
So I think for me, the thing that has helped me with rejection the most is the fact that when I'm afraid to do something, I interpret that fear as a green light. Now, I'm not talking about jumping off of cliffs and doing dangerous things or, being alone with people that give me a bad feel. I'm not talking about actual danger here. I'm talking about the fear of that emotional ego rejection. And so the thing that has helped me the most is changing my mindset around the fear of approaching someone and interpreting that fear as a green light that says, oh, you're afraid to go talk to that person? Now you gotta go talk to that person. So for me, every time I'm afraid to go talk to someone, I will go talk to them. Even if it's just to approach them and say, hey, I liked that thing you said on stage. I would love to ask you a question about it. Or, hey, I love your shoes. If I notice that I'm intimidated or afraid to talk to somebody, I have to go do it. Because if I don't uphold that strategy, then it's a slippery slope to eventually saying, oh, I'm scared to go pitch my company. I guess I just won't do it. And so for me, that's one of my fundamental values as an entrepreneur is feel the fear and do it anyway. We've all heard that quote by now, but actually having that social fear and saying, I'm not gonna let that stop me from talking to a potential investor, from talking to a potential co-founder, or even just a peer who's going to be on this journey with me, or even, a friend, or you mentioned with relationships. That same thing is true for relationships. If you feel that those nerves around like, oh my gosh, this person is so out of my league, like how am I gonna go talk to them? It's not about that person. And it's not about the potential relationship that you can have. If you go talk to someone that you think is out of your league, what you're showing yourself is that no one's out of your league. The idea of leagues, it's so irrelevant, it's so unnecessary, right? But sometimes we have to show that to ourselves, because if we don't show ourselves that we can handle the rejection, that we can bounce back, and that we're okay at the end of the day, regardless of whether or not this outcome goes the way that we wanted it to, we trust ourselves more and we're able to be more fearless when it comes to rejection in the future, because I'm not as afraid that, oh, this person is going to reject me, so what? It's like, oh, well, it might sting for a minute, but I'm gonna be over it by tomorrow.
Yeah.
And teaching ourselves that makes it so much easier to continue putting ourselves out there.
I 100% agree. And it's interesting because I've taught myself the art of rejection therapy in the entrepreneurship world. I've taught myself that in the dating world. And then I find myself in a new vertical of my life having to reteach myself that. So even in social media in particular, I do love posting on social media, but I found myself only posting just photos or our podcast episodes. So never any live videos, which was an interesting takeaway about myself, because I keep asking myself, like, why am I afraid to post a video of myself dancing in my room, for example? Like, what's stopping me from that? And to your point about leaning into that fear, I started telling my friends who are often on social media, and I was like, how do you get past that barrier? And something that they told me I thought was really, really interesting, and I can't stop thinking about this sentence: embarrassment is a construct. It's just like an idea, a concept. Like, who cares? If you can push past the idea that it's literally a construct and that the people who actually value you and care about you, and if you're your authentic self, you're gonna attract that authentic group of people who are going to support you. And anyone who doesn't, it's just in your head, this embarrassment, and if they don't, they'll leave your page, but who cares? You're not trying to serve them. And I thought that was so interesting. I was like, okay, I literally this week is when I heard it, earlier this week. And then I started posting a video of myself dancing in my apartment. And I was really proud of myself. I actually got like so much support on social media, and I know it's so small, but it's something that I'm proud of, because I don't know, it's just proving to myself I can solve the art of rejection therapy in different verticals of my life, and I still might experience a new vertical where I have to lean into that fear and really push past it.
Yeah, I love this idea around embarrassment, because I feel like when it comes to putting ourselves in embarrassing situation, the same thing is true, that something that might embarrass us at one point, as we do it over and over again, it no longer embarrasses us. And what's funny is sometimes people will read your response to a situation to see if you're embarrassed. And if you are embarrassed, it actually can make them a little bit uncomfortable, because it's like, oh, I feel bad for them. Like, imagine someone speaking on stage.
Yeah.
And imagine this person speaking and walking on stage and tripping. And imagine the whole audience is like, oh, they tripped. Like, how's this gonna go? What are they gonna say? Are they so embarrassed?
Yeah.
And imagine what happens if that person stands up and makes a joke about it. The whole audience gets to laugh and say, oh, that was okay.
Exactly.
But if the person is like super embarrassed, like, oh my gosh, like, oh, they get small, the whole audience is like cringing with them.
Yeah.
But if we can walk into those situations that might like feel embarrassing and say, this doesn't matter, like it's totally fine, the whole audience is with us.
Exactly.
Even if they are embarrassed for you or like, oh, how are they gonna respond? When you let them know, this is no big deal.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, I guess that wasn't embarrassing. And so I love this idea of embarrassment being a social construct. That doesn't mean that it doesn't feel real when we are embarrassed. But if there's one thing I've learned about putting myself out there, it's that, especially with something like public speaking, is the difference between an amateur and a professional public speaker is someone who knows how to recover.
Yes.
I like to make a lot of jokes when I'm
do they go well?
Sharing
Are they?
Well, that's where I'm getting. Not all of my jokes land.
Yeah.
And if I make it awkward, that clearly I just tried to make a joke and clearly no one thought it was funny, if I kind of sit in that moment and I'm like, oh,
if you freeze or something.
If I freeze, then it's uncomfortable now for everyone. It's very uncomfortable for me. But if I accept that, for me, my theory with humor is, I'll just throw stuff out there. If it lands, great, we get to laugh together. If it doesn't land, no problem. So much of getting something right is giving ourselves enough reps.
Yes.
Right? And you know, with stand-up comedians, that they go on a road show to test their material, because some jokes will land and some jokes won't, and over time they whittle out the jokes that don't land.
Exactly.
But in order to figure out what those are, we don't just sit in our heads to come up with the perfect stand-up comedy routine. We have to actually go out there and test things. And the only people that become successful comedians are able to say, that joke didn't land, no problem, that's not a reflection of me, it's a reflection of that joke, and I can move on.
Exactly.
And so being able to recover from that rejection, whether it's, you know, going into your room and like eating a tub of cashew milk ice cream, it's actually really good. So hypothetically speaking, you know?
Totally hypothetical.
So if you need like some alone time to process, or you're literally on stage and there is no opportunity for you to process the fact that your joke didn't land, no problem. Becoming a pro is just about knowing, oh, I can recover from this. If I say something and it doesn't land, or I say the wrong sentence, or I start to, you know, fumble over my words, I can recover from that.
And that's the whole art, right? You're just getting your reps in. The more times you do it, the less scary it gets. Like,
right.
I remember when we first started recording our first episode of Start Something as well, versus now, I feel like we're such pros. We're like, all right, let's turn on the camera, let's get them out. But the first couple episodes, we were like, okay, here's what went well, here's what went wrong, like here's how we can improve. And it's just beautiful to see where we are right now too. Like, we're already past 10 episodes, which is crazy.
Yeah, and we still, you know, we definitely have a lot of things that we've talked about, like, oh, there's room for improvement here, there's room for improvement there. But that doesn't mean that we can't celebrate the things that are going well, because as we've talked about before, the hardest part of any journey is just starting, right? It's getting over that threshold of going from not doing anything to making the move. And then once you make the move, it's just about fueling the momentum. It's so much easier to do something twice than to get started in the first place. And so I think that as you start the process of rejection therapy, it's actually easier. It's so much easier to get rejected for the 10th time or the 100th or the 1000th time than that first rejection, because it really is the first one that teaches you, oh, I'm okay with this.
Yeah.
And so if you don't have a professor that is giving you a rejection therapy exercise, I want to encourage anyone listening to come up with your own rejection experiment.
Yeah.
Because we don't need someone to orchestrate it for us. We can come up with an idea, which is maybe, hey, every time I go to a networking event, I am going to talk to every person who I feel nervous to talk to. You can start getting those little, I like to call them rookie gains, right? You start making some real tangible progress, and then over time, you're like, oh, it's no big deal. I always go talk to people I'm scared to talk to. And it's not a decision, it's a habit.
Exactly. Yeah. And the other piece of advice or takeaway or tip to kind of develop that, this is what I do. A lot of people ask me why I like to go weightlifting. And it's a strong correlation to rejection therapy in a sense, right? Because when I'm doing a chest press of like 20 pounds, right? The first time, maybe I got 5 reps. The second time, maybe 6 reps. But I always, if I work towards failure and I'm dropping that weight, over the course of a month, over the course of 2 months, I'm just getting more and more reps in. And then I go from 20 pounds to 25 pounds. And I feel like it's a constant weekly reminder that the more amount of reps that I get in, literally physically, but also like it translates into just keep getting reps mentally, you will get stronger mentally. And yeah, it's a really cool reminder. So for those of you who have not weightlifted, maybe that's a great opportunity to just practice rejection therapy.
Yeah, and I think there are so many things that we can do in our lives that are removed from the thing itself that we're working on that can teach us those lessons. And since this episode is called The Art of Rejection Therapy, I want to end with another metaphor about specifically art and how it relates to getting those reps and what those reps mean when it comes to their impact on the end result. And this has to do with rejection, but it also has to do with anything that we want to improve at. And maybe in the early days, when we're a beginner, it is a little bit embarrassing to be a beginner at something, especially as we get older, we think, oh, well, all these other girls have danced their whole lives, and I'm here just trying to figure out how to not embarrass myself. So the thing that I learned as an artist is there's this kind of famous example of this group of art students that get broken into, group A, group B. Group A was given the assignment to create the most perfect piece of pottery that they could. So this is a ceramics class, right? Group A has to come up with the best piece of pottery. And group B has to create the most pieces of pottery. So they have to create they have to hit 1,000 pieces in this group. And so they get tons and tons and tons of practice creating all these pots, failing. It doesn't matter how these pots turn out. As long as it's a pot, you're good. And this other group is working on, okay, it's gotta be the most beautiful, intricate, well-designed. You probably know what I'm getting at. Group B not only makes the most pieces of pottery, but by the end, they always make the best piece.
Yeah.
They always make the best piece. Now, I don't know if this thing has actually happened, but it's something that I heard in one of my art classes, and it's stuck with me ever since, that if we try to go make the most perfect thing, and we want to only pitch people or share our ideas with people who are going to be excited, who are going to love it, who are going to love us, we aren't going to get very far.
Yeah.
But if we're willing to just make stuff, try, put ourselves out there, show up, be willing to handle getting rejected, getting bad feedback, if we're willing to put in the work and do those reps, we will always have a much better outcome than if we decide not to pursue something because we have to get it right the first time.
Yeah.
And so I think the moral of this story, which started with a very interesting story, is getting those reps makes rejection easier. Developing a mindset that says, I can handle this, I've got my back, will make it so much easier to walk into those environments where we have to get rejected, because if we're founders, we are in the business of getting rejected.
You are signing up for that. That is part of what being an entrepreneur is. If anyone hasn't told you that, then this is a wake-up call, because you're going to go through that through every stage of your company. The moral is to go to a restaurant, a super busy restaurant.
Don't do it. But if you do, then please record yourself.
And send it to us.
Send it to us.
Really. No, the moral of the story is to find a tiny piece of your life where you can go and get rejected tomorrow. Mm-hmm. Just a tiny little thing.
Yeah, run one of these experiments.
Yeah.
Because these experiments have real lasting impacts on us.
Yes.
And so if you don't have someone in your life that's giving you your own rejection therapy protocol, come up with an easy way to get started now, because these skills are developed over time, and the fearlessness is also developed over time.
Yes.
So start as soon as you can, because this will serve you in literally anything you decide to do your entire life. I know that sounds dramatic, but I mean it.
It's true. It's true. And I think you ended it on the perfect note. So thank you all so much for
Go
another
get
amazing
rejected.
episode.
Yay!